Robert Duvall had driven past Briggs Seed and Supply 100 times without stopping. On a cold March morning in 2006, something made him pull over. What he found inside, a 78-year-old man surrounded by auction tags and a stack of legal notices, made him put his keys back in his pocket. It was March 3, 2006, and the roads through Rappahannock County, Virginia, were the particular gray of late winter, not quite frozen, not quite thawed, the fields on either side of the two-lane running flat and colorless, under a sky the color of old pewter. Duvall had been out since early morning checking fence line on the eastern edge of his property, a job he preferred to do himself, and preferred to do alone. He was heading back in the truck when he passed the white clapboard building on Route 229 that he had been passing for the better part of a decade without once slowing down. Briggs Seed and Supply had been on that corner since 1965. The building itself was older, a converted feed warehouse from the 1940s with a covered loading dock along the south wall and a hand-painted sign above the door that had been repainted exactly twice in 41 years, always in the same shade of green, always in the same blocky lettering. In the window, a cardboard display of seed varieties that hadn't been updated since the late 1990s. None of this had ever given Duvall a reason to stop. He had his own supplier for the ranch, a larger operation down in Culpeper that he'd been using for years. What made him stop on March 3rd was the sign in the window that hadn't been there the week before, hand-lettered on a piece of poster board in black marker, taped at a slight angle to the inside of the glass, Equipment Action, March 19th. All items must go. Duvall pulled into the gravel lot and sat in the truck for a moment. The lot was empty except for an old Ford flatbed parked along the side of the building, its bed carrying a load of burlap seed sacks that no one had unloaded. He got out and went inside. The interior of Briggs Seed and Supply smelled of dry earth and burlap and the particular dusty sweetness of stored grain. Metal shelving ran the length of both walls, carrying seed packets, soil amendments, small tools, and the kind of inventory that accumulates over 4 decades of serving the same farming community, some of it current stock, some of it clearly legacy product that had migrated to the back shelves and stayed. The wooden floor had been worn smooth by foot traffic in the paths between the shelves. Behind the counter, a mechanical seed counter from the 1970s, a ledger book open to a handwritten page of columns, and a stack of papers held down by a coffee mug. Wallace Briggs was at the far end of the store with his back to the door, crouching over a seed drill that had been pulled out from the storage room and set on a canvas tarp on the floor. He was writing something on a small tag and tying it to the drill's handle with a piece of twine. He was 78 years old, broad-shouldered but diminished by age, with close-cropped white hair and the hands of a man who had spent his life doing physical work, large, deliberate, the knuckles enlarged, the skin roughened to the texture of bark. He didn't look up when the bell above the door rang. Duvall walked in, looked at the shelves, looked at the seed drill with its auction tag, looked at the stack of legal papers on the counter held down by the coffee mug. He picked up a packet of winter rye from the nearest shelf and turned it over in his hands. "Help you?" Wallace said, still not looking up from the tag he was tying. "Just looking," Duvall said. "Not much left worth looking at," Wallace said. "Everything's going on the 19th. Inventory's already spoken for, bought out by the Agri Depot over in Warrenton. Shelves will be empty by the 15th. Duvall set the winter rye back on the shelf. "You closing down?" Wallace finished tying the tag, straightened up slowly, one hand braced on his knee, and turned around. He had a broad, weathered face with pale gray eyes that had the slightly flattened look of a man who had been absorbing bad news for long enough that the shock had worn off and left only the weight of it. "Closing down," he said. "Or being closed down. Depends on how you want to put it." He looked at Duvall with the brief assessing glance of a rural man meeting a stranger, noting the boots, the jacket, the absence of any equipment or purchase intent. Then he walked behind the counter and picked up his coffee mug. "You farm out here?" Wallace asked. "Some," Duvall said. "Mostly horses. I'm over on the Ridge Road past the Hazel River Bridge." Wallace nodded. "Duvall Place. I know it. You've been using Culpeper Ag for your seed." "That's right." "Smart," Wallace said without bitterness. "They're a real operation. I've been a one-man show since my son moved to Richmond in 2001. He looked at his coffee. "That's part of the problem, I suppose. though not the main part. Duvall leaned against the counter. What's the main part? Wallace set down his mug and pulled the stack of papers from under it. He didn't hand them to Duvall. He just looked at them for a moment. The way a man looks at something he's read so many times the words have stopped having individual meaning and become simply the shape of a bad situation. You know Glenfield Agrisciences? Wallace asked. I've heard the name. Big seed company, Mid-Atlantic region mostly. They came to me in 2003 with a licensing deal. Said they wanted independent retailers to carry their proprietary seed lines, branded varieties, better yields, they said, exclusive territory. He put the papers back down. I signed it. I was 75, I was tired, and the man across the desk from me had a brochure and a smile, and I wanted to believe the business had a few more years in it. He picked up his coffee again. What the contract actually said, what I found out 14 months later when I tried to bring in a competing seed line, was that I'd signed an exclusivity agreement that covered not just Glenfield's products, but my entire retail floor. I couldn't carry any seed variety that competed with anything in their catalog, which, as it turned out, covered about 80% of what I'd been selling for 40 years. Did you have a lawyer look at it before you signed? Duvall asked. I did not, Wallace said. I had a cup of coffee with the man, and a handshake, and 40 years of believing that was enough. He said it without self-pity, the flat statement of a man accounting for his own mistake. The clause they enforced was in Section 14, subsection C, in language that took me 3 reads in a dictionary to understand. It gave them the right to assess a penalty of $800 per non-compliant SKU per month for any competing product on my shelves. He paused. I had 63 non-compliant SKUs when they sent the first assessment. I didn't know I had them. I'd ordered them the previous fall before the contract went into effect. Duvall was quiet for a moment. How much do you owe them? The original assessments came to $41,000. With the interest they've applied under the contract terms, it's closer to $56,000 now. Wallace looked at the seed drill on the tarp with its auction tag. I paid down $12,000 out of savings. The rest of it is why you see what you see. Duvall looked around the store, the shelving, the worn floor, the mechanical seed counter, the ledger book open to its handwritten columns, 41 years in this room. Can I look at the contract? Duvall asked. Wallace looked at him for a moment. You a lawyer? No, Duvall said. You know contract law? No, Duvall said, but I know people who do. Wallace pulled the contract from the stack and handed it across the counter. It was a 12-page document on heavy stock paper, the Glenfield Agrisciences logo embossed at the top of the first page. Duvall read it slowly, standing at the counter. Wallace watched him without comment, refilling his coffee from a pot on the back shelf. Section 14, subsection C was on page 9. Duvall read it twice. Then he read Section 3, which covered the definition of competing products. Then he read the signature page, which showed the date of execution as April 7, 2003, and bore Wallace Briggs's signature alongside that of a Glenfield regional representative named Carter Holt. Duvall put the contract back on the counter. The competing products definition in Section 3, he said. It references Glenfield's current catalog as of the date of signing, their April 2003 catalog. Wallace nodded. That's right. Do you have a copy of that catalog? Wallace frowned slightly. I might. In the back. Why? Because if the exclusivity clause is tied to the catalog as of April 2003, and Glenfield has added product lines since then, which a company that size almost certainly has, then any SKU you carried that didn't exist in their April 2003 catalog arguably falls outside the scope of the exclusivity agreement. Duvall said it carefully, the way a man lays out a thought he isn't entirely certain of. I'm not a lawyer, but that's a question worth asking one. Wallace stared at him. They assessed me on products that weren't in the 2003 catalog? I don't know, Duvall said. That's what you'd need to find out. Wallace disappeared into the back room. He was gone for 4 minutes. When he came back, he was carrying a thin spiral-bound catalog with a Glenfield Agrisciences cover, dated spring 2003. He laid it on the counter next to the contract and began going through it against the assessment list. Duvall waited. He picked up the winter rye packet again and read the back of it. After 11 minutes, Wallace looked up. His expression had changed. Not to hope exactly, but to something adjacent to it, the look of a man who has been walking in one direction for a long time and has just been told there might be another road. 31 of the 63 SKUs they assessed me on, Wallace said slowly, are varieties they added to their catalog after 2003, some as late as 2005. Then those assessments may not be valid under the contract you signed, Duvall said, which changes the number significantly. Wallace sat down on the stool behind the counter. He put his large hands flat on the wooden surface and looked at them for a moment. I need a lawyer, he said. You do, Duvall said. I know one in Warrenton who handles agricultural contracts. She's thorough and she's not expensive. I'll call her this afternoon and ask if she'll take a look. Wallace looked at him. Why would you do that? Duvall picked up his keys from the counter where he'd set them down without noticing. Because you've been here 41 years, he said simply. And the man who wrote Section 14, subsection C, was counting on you not having anyone to read it with you. He left the contract and the catalog on the counter for Wallace to keep together. He drove back to the ranch, made the call to the attorney in Warrenton, a woman named Patricia Osei who had done work for two of his neighbors and come recommended both times, and gave her the broad outline of the situation. Patricia Osei drove out to Briggs Seed and Supply the following Monday. She spent 2.5 hours with Wallace in the contract. Her assessment confirmed what Duvall had suggested. 31 of the 63 assessed SKUs postdated the April 2003 catalog and fell outside the scope of the exclusivity clause as written. The remaining 32 assessments were valid under the contract, but the interest calculation Glenfield had applied used a compounding method that Patricia argued was not authorized under the contract's payment terms. She sent a formal response to Glenfield Agrisciences' legal department on March 14th, 5 days before the scheduled auction. The letter outlined the catalog discrepancy, challenged the interest calculation, and requested a full accounting of the assessments with supporting documentation. Glenfield's legal team responded 8 days later. After 2 weeks of correspondence, they agreed to void the 31 post-catalog assessments and recalculate the interest on the remaining balance. Wallace Briggs's total obligation, as finally settled, came to $19,400, less than half of the $56,000 he had believed he owed. The auction on March 19th was canceled. The seed drill went back into the storage room. The auction tags came off the equipment one by one, Wallace untying each piece of twine with the same deliberate hands that had tied them. The poster board sign came out of the window. The Agri Depot in Warrenton, which had already paid a deposit on the inventory buyout, received a refund. Briggs Seed and Supply stayed open. Wallace negotiated a payment plan with Glenfield for the remaining $19,000, paid it off over 14 months, and quietly let the licensing agreement expire at the end of its term without renewal. He restocked his shelves with the independent seed lines he'd carried for 4 decades. His regulars, the farmers and smallholders of Rappahannock County who had been coming to that white clapboard building since before some of them could drive, came back. Wallace never knew the name of the man who had read Section 14, subsection C with him that March morning. He described him once to Patricia Osei as a quiet man, older, worn jacket, the kind of person who reads a contract the way a mechanic listens to an engine, looking for the thing that isn't quite right. Patricia thought she recognized the description, but didn't say so. Duvall drove past Briggs Seed and Supply many times after that. He never stopped again. The hand-painted sign above the door was still green, still blocky, still legible from the road. Sometimes the lights were on inside in the early morning. Sometimes there was a truck in the lot. That was enough. Some buildings earn their corners. Some men earn their right to stay in the rooms they've built their lives around. And sometimes the only thing standing between a man and the loss of everything is one paragraph on page 9, and someone patient enough to read all the way to the end. Wallace Briggs read that paragraph in 2003 and didn't understand it. He read it again in 2006 and still couldn't find his way through it alone. But on a cold March morning, on a road he'd driven 100 times, a man stopped who could. And Briggs Seed and Supply stayed on that corner for 11 more years, until Wallace finally locked the door himself on his own terms at the age of 89, which was exactly how it should have been. Not because anyone had rescued him or fought his battle for him or handed him something he hadn't earned, but because someone had stopped long enough to read the fine print, and Wallace Briggs had spent 41 years being the kind of man worth stopping for.